Let's talk Stanley Cups. So we've all talked about how the Gary Bettman era destroyed Canada and all that we stand for and all of this. Here's the funny thing. I've been doing a lot of talking about Stanley Cups over the last little while. And there's some numbers in here that are kind of interesting considering the argument that gets made by people who say certain words about how certain systems are set up these days. Now, it's not fair. It's not fair to the Canadian teams. It's weird. Canada, Canada, States, Canada, States, Canada, States, States, Canada, 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 States, 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 Canada, 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 States, States, Canada. Yep, Canada wins a lot of cups. But here's the thing. Here's the thing people argue and ignore, and it's so weird to me. I find it so strange. When the NHL doubled its size to 12 in 1967, 2 out of 12 teams were Canadian. Montreal and Toronto. Toronto has never won a Stanley Cup again. And I haven't heard a whole lot of conspiracy theories against Toronto, which is kind of weird. Because mathematically they should have. When there was 12 teams in the league, it was won twice by Canadian teams in 3 years. And this is where it gets interesting. If you want to make it sound like it's conspiratorial, don't talk about which teams won Stanley Cups or why. Just say what country they came from. When there was 14 teams and 3 of them were Canadian, one of them was the Canucks, 1 team out of 2 was Canadian that won the Stanley Cup. When there was 16 teams for 2 years, 1 out of 2 teams, or 1 out of 2 Stanley Cups went to Canada. When there were 18 teams in the league and 3 of them were Canadian, 3 out of 4 Stanley Cups were in Canada. There was 1 year of 17 teams when Cleveland merged with Minnesota. Canadian team won it that year. When there were 21 teams in the league and 6 of them were Canadian for 1 year, while Atlanta hadn't decided to move to Calgary yet, 0 out of 1 Stanley Cups were won by Canadian teams. When 7 of 21 teams were Canadian, so 33% of the league, 7 out of 10 Stanley Cups went to Canadian teams. 70% of the Stanley Cups went to Canada, 33% of the teams were Canadian. When there were 22 teams for 2 years, 0 out of 2 Stanley Cups went to Canada. And when they expanded to 24 teams, the year before Gary Bettman took over, 1 out of 1 Stanley Cups went to Canada. You can make any argument you want. You can. You can look at this and say, well, 16 out of 21 Stanley Cup champions that year, or 16 out of 26 Stanley Cup champions were from Canada. Less than 30% of the league was Canadian for most of this time, so clearly there was a bias in favor of Canadian teams. We can ignore that Montreal has 9 of those Stanley Cups. We can ignore that Edmonton had 5 of them. And when we look at the American teams that won, it's 2 for Boston, 2 for Philly, 4 for the Islanders, and 2 for Pittsburgh. So clearly, American teams weren't allowed to only win 1 Stanley Cup. They were required to win 2 during this era. And you can make any argument you'd like. And they're kind of fun. And when I started setting up for this video, I thought, okay, Shannon, now you could bring out the sarcasm and lay it on thick. And do the whole conspiratorial crap you did a couple weeks ago about Bettman. But honestly, I find it weird. I find it strange that percentages get mentioned a lot. Like, well, by percentages, teams should win. No. No. Because you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 teams won the Stanley Cup between 1968 and 1993. Doesn't wash. It doesn't work at all. By percentages, this shouldn't happen. But it does because certain teams knew how to build. The Montreal Canadiens knew how to build, and then they forgot after 1993. And I've discussed the trade that basically sunk them. And not as much that Raw leaving hurt Montreal the most. It was the management structure at the time just tore the whole thing apart. And Montreal's never got back to where they were. Now, if Montreal's not a dominant team in the 70s, then there's more American Stanley Cups, and we'd have something to complain about back then. Because Philly would have won more Stanley Cups. Boston would have won more Stanley Cups. The Islanders might have won one before 1980. But this is what happens. This is why I don't look at how many years it's been since a Canadian team won. Because I look at every year on its face. And I go, yeah. No, it works. The game, we may view it as being Canadian. Majority of the teams have always been American. The difference was when the Stanley Cup Finals rolled around in the 80s and the 70s, you had a pretty good shot at winning a Stanley Cup if you cheered for Montreal or Edmonton. And if you're a Canadian and you wanted to see the Stanley Cup in Canada, you got it 16 out of 26 times. And even though the American teams made up a lion's share of the league the entire time, they had 10 Stanley Cups in 26 years, which there were never complaints about that I ever saw. I don't remember seeing any complaints in 1990 about how Canada was dominating Stanley Cup finals and Stanley Cup results. I don't remember seeing it. So, you know, this video can stay up and sort of serve as a, hey, here you go, guys. And I could even go back to the original 6 era when you've got 2 out of 6 teams that are Canadian and go over the fact that 33% of the league was Canadian and how many Stanley Cups Canada won. Because it's equally ridiculous. I looked over it. Because, again, if you're just looking at borders, if you're not looking at the actual franchises and the actual teams, it is really easy to get caught up in this narrative. But if you look at franchises, you look at Chicago's 3 wins in 5 years as a franchise recently. You look at those 2 wins by LA in 3 years. You look at the back-to-back Cups by Pittsburgh in 2016 and 2017. You look at Detroit's record when Stevie Yzerman was leading the team. And honestly, you know, the best teams usually win. And it's weird because up until this point, you're not going to get very much argument that the best teams didn't win. The difference is, since the salary cap came in and since the league got as big as it did, it's really hard. It's almost impossible to build that kind of a dynasty look. It really is. The Flyers were close to a dynasty too. They had Stanley Cup Finals in there too. That they were close. Buffalo could have won a Stanley Cup in there too. But you know, if you're not going to see the dominance by individual franchises, and if you're only going to see the border and which side of the border they're on, it's really easy to make your argument. But it's really easy to make this argument too. It's just a curious thing I was looking at between 1968 and 1993. It's a similar timeline to what we're looking at from 1994 until now, and it's a similar story. Remember, you know, the States makes up the lion's share of teams now, and you know it's. But by percentages, Canada had a ton of wins, considering they didn't have very many. And when there's 3 teams, one of those is the Canucks, and they never got anywhere near the Stanley Cup when there was less than 21 teams. And 1982, on paper they made it to the final, but they really didn't get close to the Cup because the Islanders destroyed them. So there you go. There's my latest sort of commentary regarding this year's Stanley Cup final and some of the theories about the States and Canada and the state of where things are. But really, honestly, you could have made the opposite argument from 1993 and before if you only look at the border and you only look at where the teams play. If you don't actually look at the organizations and who the great organizations are, it's sort of like Washington. The other thought I had of doing before this was to look at Washington over the Ovechkin era and where they've been close. And I'm still likely going to do that. But I wanted to do this first. Because honestly, you easily could have argued that the NHL was favoring Montreal up until 1979. And there's that argument that's out there that the system as it was favored Montreal winning unlimited Stanley Cups, but that's not true. They acquired Guy Lafleur in a trade with a boneheaded organization from California. And that set them up for the next decade because they were stupid. And honestly, when I look at the way some organizations are run on both sides of the border, I just say, well, they're run incompetently. So, there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And again, this is just for numbers' sake. This is just to look at numbers. 16 cups for Canada. And we never had anywhere near half the teams. And we won more than half the cups. We basically had 30% of the league for most of that time. Let me know your thoughts. I'll talk to you again soon.